Well, good evening, everyone. Just doing some housekeeping over here. What are you all doing here? Just kidding. Welcome, everybody. I'm Father John Muir. I'm the pastor here at St. Thomas Aquinas. Great to see you all. It's just a delight to have you here at these really special nights we call Summa. It's a chance to get together and to open up our hearts and minds to the power and the truth of some aspect of the Catholic faith. It's just an exciting topic tonight, and I have a few minutes to spend with you as people kind of trickle in, dropping off kids for other programs to do a stand-up comedy routine to warm you up. No, I'm just kidding. It's really just to welcome you and to tell you how excited I am for the talk tonight. One of the biggest topics that people struggle with today in this culture when it comes to things of the Christian faith in general and the Catholic faith in particular is a kind of perception of a rivalry between the truths of science, the physical sciences, hard sciences, and the truths of religion. They're seen as implacable enemies, locked in a kind of zero-sum game. If we say things on this side are true, then things on this side must be more false, right? But if we say the things on this side of the ledger are true, well, guess what happens? Things on the other side have to be false, right? That's a zero-sum game. What I think you'll discover tonight in this exciting talk and really important topic is that's just not the way it is at all. In fact, au contraire, as they say in the country of some of my forebears. On the contrary, the truth is just the opposite. The relationship between the truths of science, say the truths that we come to know through things like the scientific method, and the truths known by faith, what our founder, our patron, St. Thomas Aquinas would call the truths of divine revelation, what's known by the light of faith, are indeed intellectual, rational truths, and the truths available to us through our rationality and empirical study are also true, and there's a deep union, in fact, a kind of necessary complementarity there. I grew up Catholic, and so I never went through a phase in my life where I thought science was bad. I always thought like science was amazing. Even as a young priest here in Phoenix, I was invited over to someone's house for dinner, and there was a priest sitting next to me who's kind of dressed like me, you know, these snazzy outfits. And I was just ordained, and I said, "Who are you?" And he said, "Oh, I'm Father George." And I said, "Oh, well, what do you do?" I'm an assistant at this parish in Phoenix." And he said, "Oh, I run the observatory in Tucson." And I said, "The what? Like, what are you observing?" And he said, "Stars. It's a Vatican observatory." So he said, the Vatican owns land in Italy, right? But guess where else the Vatican owns land? Arizona, down in Tucson, the old Pueblo. So it's literally Vatican land. Isn't that cool? I don't know how often the Pope gets there, but his job was to do astrophysics. That was his job. About 2 years ago, I was having another dinner with some priests, and a young priest who just came here to Phoenix. Now he's working at Brophy. He's teaching physics. And I said, "What? Now you teach at Brophy, huh? What do you teach?" He goes, "Physics." I said, "Oh, physics. Well, what did you do before you were teaching physics?" And he said, "I was doing astrophysics." And I said, "Well, like, what do you mean?" He said, "My job was to identify the materials of which certain stars were made of, which we just haven't done yet." Apparently, there's so many stars that we've only begun to figure out where they are, what they're called, and what they're made out of. And his job was to sit there 10 hours a day, looking at the stars and figuring out what their chemical composition was. And then offer Mass at the end of the day, right? He's a Catholic priest, everybody. So as Catholics, there's like a whole mind-blowing world to discover here, and then to share confidently with this culture. Just a couple other examples. There's a man named Gregor Mendel. Maybe you've heard of him. He discovered a little thing called genetics. So the principles of hereditary principles, like why you look a little bit like your mama and why you look a little bit like your daddy. He figured out how that works. It's called genetics. He figured out genetic code, and he happened to be an Augustinian monk and a Catholic priest. Does it sound like I'm bragging? I'm not. I'm just telling you, like, how about another one? How about, have you ever heard of the principle of singularity or the Big Bang principle, which Einstein himself thought was kind of a joke until this guy named, let's see if I'll remember it. Help me out, the guy who invented the Big Bang. Georges Lemaitre, thank you, whoever said that. Yeah, the Belgian guy, Georges Lemaitre. So he figured out that actually the universe is expanding and came from a point of singularity, and then it's moving at a rapid rate, and the principles of entropy and things like that. And it's about 13.8 billion years old. Well, guess what he was? A Catholic priest. And so there's these pictures of Einstein standing next to Georges Lemaitre looking like this. He had a bigger collar, he was like this. And they're standing there, and he convinced Einstein that this makes sense. And anyway, I could go on and on. You know, Isaac Newton himself was a devout believer in God. So this notion that science and religion are enemies is just actually kind of a new prejudice, and it's just frankly pretty wrong. And not only are they not enemies, but they love each other, and they need each other. And as Catholics, we have a lot to offer the culture. We spent a lot of the 19th century trying to convince people that faith makes sense. And then we spent a lot of the 20th century trying to convince people that reason is valid. And now we're spending the 21st century trying to convince the world that both are extremely important paths of truth and rationality, and in fact, deeply complementary. Our speaker tonight is a wonderful woman that I've been blessed to work side by side with here on this campus next door. Her name's Teresa Morris. She holds a master's degree from Catholic University of America, a pontifical university here in these United States, where she holds a master's in bioethics. So the morality related to medicine and science, and the science of how we treat the body and the physical world. She also has degrees in psychology as well as philosophy. And we're just delighted to have her tonight. So I hope you'll join me in giving a warm welcome to Teresa Morris. Welcome, Teresa.
That's gonna work. Does this work? Oh, okay. All right. Hello, everyone. Good evening. Father was like, I'm not going to steal your thunder. I'm not going to. And I was like, okay, well, do I really need to talk after that? Because he kind of like spoiled the whole thing, which is essentially that science and religion, though the culture and society, and sometimes even both of those fields, sometimes kind of pit themselves against each other, or it seems like they're not compatible. Really, they're deeply compatible, and there's a huge need for them to be compatible and to kind of work together with one another in modern society. So like Father said, my undergrad is in philosophy, and my master's is in bioethics, which is essentially the field where we're trying to evaluate whether or not new technologies and new advancements and innovation in medicine and science are ethical, and if they are in line with our understanding of the human person and human dignity. So while this might not be like your ideal way to spend a Wednesday night, it's my ideal way to spend a Wednesday night talking about these things. So I just want to start with a question. Raise your hand if you think that science exists in heaven. Does science exist in heaven? Maybe. Okay, hands down. Raise your hand if religion exists in heaven. Okay, hands down. Raise your hand if you're worried about committing heresy right now. We don't. Okay. Heaven, ultimately, obviously none of us have ever been there, but in a kind of a simple way, heaven is the complete union of the human person with God, right? Total union with God. And what that means is every single part of the human person is completed and happy in heaven. So it's just an experience of completeness. There's nothing more that we desire once we've reached heaven. So what that means is every single part of the human person reaches its fullness and completion. So human person is made of body and soul, and then once we get to the soul realm, the soul has two rational powers. Those rational powers are the intellect and the will. The intellect wants truth. That's what makes the intellect happy, is when it's told the truth, when it's learning something new, it makes it happy. That's why when we like spend forever on Netflix or like scrolling Instagram or whatever, we sort of feel just like blobs, But if you like learn something new or you're reading a book, you feel better, right? You feel more human. It's because the intellect is finding truth, and that's what it wants. It's what makes it happy. The will wants freedom. So this is where we get the term free will. What makes the will happy is the ability to freely choose. So if heaven is total completion of the human person, heaven is an experience of body and soul and the rational powers of the soul, intellect and will, finding completion in heaven. So what that means is there's something about God that is pleasing to the intellect and pleasing to the will. Those things are that God is truth, right? It's not just that it's like we're able to find truth in heaven, but it's that God himself is truth, right? He says this so many times to us. I'm the way, the truth, and the life, right? He is truth itself. He is freedom itself. So when we experience completion, we're experiencing a relationship with the fullness of those things, which is a person. So truth itself is a person, and so when we encounter it, we're encountering something about the personhood of God himself. So once we know that, we can kind of like come back down and understand, okay, if that's what heaven is, then science and religion in their best forms, when they're doing what they should be doing, are tools that help us understand truth. And if they're helping us understand truth, then they're helping us understand God. So what that means is that they're not necessary in heaven. So neither really exists in heaven, right? We don't need science in heaven because we already have the fullness of truth. So we don't need to know the truth about anything else because we have truth itself that we're in relationship with. We don't really need religion in heaven. We'll still be considered like the body of Christ, but we won't need religion in the sense that we don't need the sacraments, right? You don't need to baptize your kid in heaven. You don't need to go to confession. You don't need to receive the Eucharist because you're already receiving the fullness of those things in heaven. So these tools that we're given in science and religion are just that. They're tools to help us understand truth and experience it on earth so that we can eventually get to God in heaven. So that kind of is like, okay, well then, like, why do we need to sit and talk about the two of them, right? If like they're both going to kind of like fall away when we get to heaven. The importance of that is that on earth, because there's goodness in both of those and because what we want is truth itself, sometimes we can cling too much to either one of them, right? And that's kind of how our society is. Our society is super polarized. We love just being like, everything is against each other, right? You have to pick a side on everything. And the same kind of happens to science and religion, that you sort of are put in a position of you're either a religious person, in which case you just don't mess around with science because that's kind of like dangerous, or you're a scientific person, in which case you kind of just don't acknowledge God because that might be too like woo-woo, right? And what can happen when we sort of allow ourselves to fall into one of these camps is we can make one of those things our God instead of God himself. So if we make science our God, we can become really obsessed with like taking in every like new scientific innovation and being like obsessed with health, right? And kind of like pretending that we can live forever and not really acknowledging that there's an afterlife and just being like totally enveloped in that. We can also fall into that in the religious side of things, right? That we become too obsessed with religion itself that we forget that it's supposed to point us to God, right? A couple years ago, when I was living in DC, there was a relic of St. Therese that was going around the country. And I just went to the normal mass that I go to, and I didn't know that this relic was going to be there. And I walked into mass, and I was like, what is going on? I thought there was a wedding or something, because I had never in my life seen the church that packed. And it's because there was veneration of the relic before mass. And while that was beautiful, and it's wonderful to venerate a relic, I was like, there's something kind of wrong here, right? That we're like so obsessed with this relic, which is like part of our religion, that we're forgetting that you can literally eat God in mass, and like no one's showing up for that, but we're showing up to venerate part of someone's body who has since passed away. But you can literally receive the Eucharist in mass, but not everyone's showing up for that. And so that's an example of how we can sometimes make religion our God instead of God himself. Instead of it being a tool and an avenue to get to him, it becomes its own thing that we're too focused on, instead of being like, oh right, you're the whole reason for all of this. So now that we kind of understand, okay, there's a proper order of things. Science and religion are good. They both are used as tools to help us understand truth. We can kind of then work backwards and see how they then work well together and can integrate together. There is, in the Bible, I think that the most heartbreaking line in the Bible is in Genesis, and it occurs after Adam and Eve have eaten the fruit, and they realize that they're naked, right? So like the whole proposal of Satan in the garden was, if you eat this fruit, you'll have more knowledge than God does, right? You will have access to more knowledge than God does. And that sounded really awesome, right? And that's kind of like sometimes the proposal, it seems, of science is like, maybe we can figure out something that God hasn't figured out yet, or maybe we can figure out that we don't need him. So it's not a new idea. That temptation, like be all-knowing and to have everything figured out, is not new. It's actually very ancient, right? It's like the original fall of man is related to that temptation of we just want to know everything. We want certainty. We don't like this whole have faith and have trust thing. So what happens, Adam and Eve eat the fruit, and then they realize that they're naked, and so they're like, what do we do? Fig leaves, cool. So they cover themselves with fig leaves, and so they're just kind of hiding, and God comes into the garden. He's like, okay, what are you guys doing? And so he walks in, and he's like, okay, hi guys, I see you. Like, why are you hiding? And they respond, we're hiding because we were naked. And what he says then should really break our hearts. He says, who told you that you were naked? And what he's saying when he says that, he's not saying like, who let out this big secret, like we didn't want you guys to find out. And he's also not angry. He's saying, who told you you were naked? What he's saying is, who told you there's something wrong with what I created and how I created you? Because you're trying to fix it, and it doesn't need fixing. And that should kind of break our hearts, because that's what we sometimes do when we're trying to control creation. We're saying to God, it's not good enough. We can make it better. And that temptation to do that's not a new temptation. And that's what we see now in some scientific realms when we're really like heavily manipulating the human person, or we're doing all this new research on DNA, or last week we gave a human being a pig heart, and that brought up all these questions of like, is a human being still fully human if they have the heart of another animal, et cetera, et cetera. What we're trying to do is we're trying to look at God's creation, and we're saying we need to cover it up, or we need to change it, or we need to make it better, and he's looking at us going, who told you that? Who told you? Who's lying to you and telling you that there's something wrong with how I created this? Because there's nothing wrong with it. So that has kind of like spiraled, and that theme has come up throughout all of human history. C.S. Lewis says that as early on as human beings had the ability to think, we were trying to separate the material world from the spiritual realm. We were trying to make sense of them separately. And because it's easier for us, it's easier for humans to be like, if I figure this out, then that is like done and taken care of, and then I can move on to this. When really our entire existence is an integration of the two. But what happens is we split into these two realms of materialism and religion. And materialism says all that is true is what can be seen through material, right? Things that I can touch and see and feel and that I can prove exist. And if I can't prove it, it's not real. There's no way. It's the materialist view. The religious view is we only deal with things of faith, right? That everything is God, and therefore we shouldn't even like try to know things, because like how can you know something that's all-knowing and mysterious? So there's always that split. And what Catholicism does is Catholicism comes in and says, actually, that's really reductionistic. You can't reduce the human experience, and you can't reduce human knowledge, and you can't reduce truth to those two separate things. That there's a better way, and there's a way in which these two things play off of one another. But we see that all the time. When I was in grad school, I was kind of having this debate with a doctor about surrogacy, and he said to me, you could be really great, but you're too religious. And I was like, isn't that kind of the point, though? Right? Like the whole reason that we are able to understand truth is through the light of faith, that those two things need to go together to have the most full picture that we have access to. And why wouldn't we want the most full picture? Why would I settle for just one or the other when you can have a broader worldview? So what I think the hesitation is for people of faith is much more on the scientific realm than in the religious realm, right? like, we don't really need to prove that God is good or that religion is important, right? I think we kind of like all sort of know that. But what we have to kind of grapple with is the question of, is science good? And are we just going to kind of accept it because it's part of the world, or is there actually something perhaps even holy about this field? So to reconcile this, I kind of want to look at what science really is. And in order to do this, I want to look at one of the proofs of God's existence from St. Thomas Aquinas. So St. Thomas Aquinas gives 5 proofs of God's existence. And he does this in his Summa, and he's doing it in a way that's saying you don't have to be Catholic, you don't have to be Christian, you don't have to be religious in order to kind of get to the point of there's probably a deity that exists, right? And you actually don't even need religion to get to the point of that deity is actually good and on my side. So he gives these 5 proofs, and I feel like if you've ever been to a Mass with Father Mir, you've heard them at some point. But he basically gives the argument of the unmoved mover, so that we can know that there's a God because things are in motion, right? What does the moon look like right now? Who has noticed it in the past couple of days? It's a full moon, yeah. And 3 weeks ago, it was not a full moon, and it was a crescent moon. So a long time ago, people looked at the sky and they were like, that thing is moving. Like, what's causing that? Something's changing here, right? Anytime we see things in motion, we naturally know something has set that in motion. That's why in horror movies, when it like pans to a hallway and then like a child's toy rolls along, people are like, oh my gosh, something's in the house, right? Because you know something must have moved that. So when we see things in motion, we see the world in motion, we see growth, we understand that something has set that in motion, and that thing that set it in motion we call God. So that's the first one. The next one is the argument of the uncaused cause or the efficient cause, which is an argument from cause and effect. So certain things exist, something must have caused them, the things in existence are the effects, whatever must have originally caused it, right? Everything has a cause. I have a cause, which is my parents, and their cause is their parents, and if you just keep tracing everything back, eventually you get to a first cause, which is God. The next is the argument from necessary being or contingency, which is that there has to be an existence of being that cannot not exist, which means that everything else is dependent on that one thing. So for example, if you like made lunch today, so say you made a sandwich, that sandwich is contingent on you, right? So I know that something created that, and its existence is contingent on you, so you can't not exist. You have to exist for that sandwich to exist. And that's kind of similar to how it is for us, that something had to have given everything else being, and that something is God. The fourth is an argument of gradation of being, so that everything kind of exists in grades or steps, so that we can understand the quality of something because we know that there's a maximum amount of that, right? So when I go home to Virginia for the summer, everyone's like, it's so hot, and I'm like, oh, you think it's hot? Like, guess how hot it is in Arizona, right? And everyone's like, that's so annoying, be quiet. But it's like when it's 90 degrees there, but I've experienced 118 degrees here, that's my concept of there's a gradation there. So my experience of how hot the weather can be is always in comparison to the maximum amount that I know. And that's what we understand God's nature to be, that if you experience goodness or beauty or truth or love, you can understand the quality of that thing because there's a maximum amount of that thing, and that maximum amount exists in the person of God. Finally, my favorite one, and this is what we're going to spend time on, is the argument from intelligent design. And this is also called the argument of teleology. So everything in existence has a telos. Telos means what is something's purpose. So like this podium's purpose is to hold paper. The pew's purpose is to be eat. Clothes' purpose is to be worn. So everything in existence has a telos. So the argument of teleology or intelligent design is that if you look around at the world, it seems like something has designed it, and that something has intelligence. So even if you just look at the way that flowers are, or like pineapples, they're like these little hexagons making up a pineapple, and it's a perfect spiral. You kind of look at the world and you're like, this doesn't really seem like it could be random. The other day I was hiking in the mountains, and I was by myself, there was no one else around. Middle of the trail were these stones that were stacked on top of each other to make a pyramid, which tells me that what else had been there at some point? Yeah, a person. And it could not have been a blade of grass, it couldn't have been a butterfly, it couldn't have been a coyote. It had to have been a person, because in order to put it directly in the exact middle of the trail and to stack them all up like that, whoever did that had to have had intelligence. There was an intentional choice there to do it that way. And so when we look at the world, we see that everything kind of has this intentionality and this intelligence and this design. So the fact that the Earth is spinning at like 1,000 miles an hour, and then on top of that, it's rotating around the sun, and we're all just in here chilling like we're not actually moving, something has put that all in balance and has said, this is how I want things to be, and has designed things to be perfectly balanced in this way. So that's the argument from intelligent design, that it's not possible for all of that to be random. It's not. So again, this goes back to the whole, like, who told you there's something wrong with what I created? Because there's obviously not. It's wild. Maybe one thing could have randomly happened. Maybe, but probably not. And this is what the field of science looks at. The field of science looks at the designs of the intelligent designer and investigates those designs. And so in doing that, scientists are seeking to understand the nature of the designer by seeking to know more about his designs, and in doing so, deeply honors the designer. So the field of physics honors the intelligent designer by looking at the design of motion. The field of chemistry honors the designer by looking at the design of the composition of things. The field of medicine honors the designer by looking at what causes disease and how to heal the human body. And you could just like go on and on and on. That any branch of science is deeply invested in trying to understand what the world is doing and how it's doing it. And anytime we seek to understand creation, we're seeking to understand the creator, right? When you look at what someone creates or what someone makes, you understand something about that person. So you know something about that person by the fruit of what they do. So teachers know this, that when you like teach a kid for, X number of months, and then you have a parent-teacher conference, and you're kind of talking to the parents, and you're like, oh yeah, I kind of feel like I already know you because I spend all day long with the fruit of you, right, with your creation. You kind of know something about them because you're spending time with their creation. In a similar way that when people meet like their favorite author, or you go to a concert of your favorite artist, you feel like you know them because you know their creation, right? This is why like every millennial woman is like, Taylor Swift is my big sister, because we're like, know her lyrics, right? And when you know what someone has created, you know something about that person. And that's what science is doing, right? They're just trying to know what God has created, and in doing so, they know something about that person. So that's kind of what science does. It's this investigation into the intelligent design of the intelligent designer, which means that anyone who's doing science is directly interacting with God himself, which is really cool and makes me a little bit jealous, but it's not my calling. A practical example of this, in 2016, there was this discovery that at the moment of fertilization, there is an actual spark that occurs. And we, obviously, up until the point of 2016, we didn't know that. And this is where science and religion kind of start to play off of each other really beautifully, is that Catholics have always said, we honor life from the moment of conception, right, no matter what. We think that something important and significant happens there. And then in 2016, scientists were like, hey guys, so crazy, there's like a firework that happens at conception. That must be kind of important. And we were like, right, we've said that for a while now. And that's where science and religion are not against each other, right? They complement each other very well. And so what religion is doing in a situation like that is it's saying, we have this view of the same thing, but it's giving you a little more information about it, right? And science is saying, hey, religion, we have more information of this thing that you already believe, and how cool is that, right? That they're in no way against one another, that they're actually making the other one better and building the other one up by providing more information for the other so that the two kind of work together. In JP2's encyclical Fides et Ratio, which is his encyclical on faith and reason, the opening line is this line where he says, faith and reason are like two wings that the human spirit soars upon to the contemplation of truth. And I read that for the first time when I was like 14, and I immediately thought of a bird, which I think is his intention. And if you kind of think about that faith and reason are like two wings on a bird that's soaring to contemplate truth. And when one is doing well, the other is like also doing well, right? That it's built up and it is getting there faster. But if you cripple one and you say we don't need one, or one is doing what it's supposed to do incorrectly, then the entire mission is kind of starting to fail, right? But if both are doing what they're meant to do correctly, then you're actually getting to the contemplation of truth faster. And that's kind of what happens when science and religion work together in a great way like that. That there's this collaboration between the two, and both are authentically seeking truth and trying to understand truth in a more full and more authentic way. So again, we're not trying to reduce these fields to something totally separate, right? We don't just want to say that, hey, science, like you do your thing, and like we're going to be over here doing our thing, and we're just going to be like, go team, cheer each other on. But that you actually need the two of them to be working together, and in doing so, there's just case after case of saying, wow, these things that we've kind of already believed are actually now being backed up. And every field of science can bring more information about that thing, right? And this happens just across the board, that there's this integration of these two truths. The fact that a mother who's breastfeeding is gonna like self-diagnose her child, right? Like her body is gonna take in the child's saliva and go, oh my gosh, he or she is sick with something, and then her breast milk changes, and then it's like fixing the baby, right, and treating the baby. That's wild, right? We couldn't have done that on our own. And so there's something where it's like, oh yeah, we honor motherhood and we honor like the distinctness of feminine biology, and then science is like, yeah, and here's this other reason that just kind of backs that up and shows you additionally how cool God is. So it's similar to when if a child draws something for you, right? And they're like, here, I made you this picture. We have a couple options when something like that happens. We can be like, wow, thank you so much, and then put it on the fridge, right? Or we can say, I don't, like, thanks so much, and then kind of like put it away and not really touch it. Or we can say, hey, why did you choose that color? Or who is this person that you drew alongside your family? And they're like, oh, that's my teacher. And then you're like, oh, do you think that your teacher is part of your family? And they're like, yeah, because I love her, like whatever, right? And then so they're telling you, this is why I chose this color, this is why I added this person, all this. And we're understanding something about the child by investigating why they created in that way. And that's kind of how science and religion go together in that same way, right? That it's like, we're not just supposed to be like, cool, put things on the fridge and never really think about it or look at it again. We're supposed to be curious. We're supposed to be investigating. We're supposed to have wonder. So when we look at this idea of like from all human history, human beings were trying to be materialistic or religious, what was happening is human beings didn't know how to deal with our sense of wonder, which is an incredible gift that we have, right? We have this amazing gift that we have the ability to be in awe of the world and to look at the world and say, why are things the way that they are? And children naturally do that, right? You spend time around a toddler, they're like, why is this the case and why is this the case? And they're just delighting in everything. And then we like lose that a little bit as we grow up, but we still have this idea of like, well, why is that, right? Like, why do we need things? Why does the world work like this? Why do we have seasons? Why is it hotter closer to the equator versus farther away? Like all these things, right? That is good. That curiosity is part of the gift that God has given our intellect, where he's like, I'm not going to force you to choose me. I'm not going to force you to seek out information about me, because that's not what someone who wants a relationship of love does, right? To truly love someone is to say, I'm freely going to choose you and I'm freely going to seek out information about you because I want to know you, because I'm in love with you. But God doesn't force that, but he gives us these little things where he's like, but maybe if you're curious about this, then maybe you'll find out something about me. and then you will start to fall in love with me, right? Our ability to wonder at the world is part of our intellect, and when we don't know how to wonder well, we try to split up the world into two separate ideas. But when we can take our wonder seriously, we can say, all right, these things actually can be compatible. And it's sometimes hard to live like that. It's hard to say, how am I going to be in the world and not of the world? How am I going to allow both science and religion to inform the way that I live? Because it's easier to just go like all in on one. We love being just like polarized. But to live in that integration of the two is what we're made for, because that's where fruit occurs. Fruit always happens at the place of integration, right? Our entire faith is a faith of integration. Everything in the world is complementary, right? Men and women are complementary, but the fruit happens in the integration of the two, right? Men and women are always going to be complementary, but when they come together, then there's actual literal fruit from that complementarity and from that integration. And so the fruit of the human experience and the fruit of the human intellect actually occurs at the intersection of science and religion. So once we know that, then we know that religion is going to be at its best when it learns from science, that it can actually be made better by science. It's at its best when it learns from science and it takes seriously the truths that science puts out there, right? Once upon a time, there was a man named Galileo who the church didn't like that much because he said, I don't actually think the planets are revolving around the earth. I think we're actually revolving around the sun. And the church was like, nope, we don't want anything to do with that. And then centuries later had to kind of apologize for that. And that's where religion was at its best, where it said, oh, we kind of created our own theology about what we thought maybe God had done, but you're telling us what God actually has done. And that's where religion is at its best, when it says, oh, you've told us something about how God designed the world. We're going to take that seriously, and it's going to help inform the beliefs that we already have. And then science is at its best when it learns from religion, and it takes seriously human dignity, and it takes seriously things like the family, and it takes seriously things like human life, and it respects those things. So when the two of them are learning from the other, we're actually building each other up. So again, it's those two wings soaring towards the contemplation of truth. Where I think a lot of the tension comes in, and a lot of sometimes the fear, is, well, what if science gets kind of out of control? And that sometimes can occur, right? That science can do some crazy things. Last year, there's this new technology called CRISPR, and it doesn't really have a lot of regulation in China, and they just made a human being out of skin cells. So they didn't really need anything else. They just took human skin cells and just created a baby. And we were all kind of like, we really wish you hadn't done that. That's not great, right? That's not when science is at its best. So in an ideal world, what religion does is it takes science and it says, hey, you have this incredible capacity to understand God in the way that he has designed the world. Let me help guide you so that nothing is wasted, right? So that no one's intellect, no one's ability is wasted in science. Let's guide you. And so religion can kind of create boundaries for science, not in a way that is limiting its freedom, but in a way that's actually helping it get to its end faster and better and with less risk to human dignity. Because that's actually what freedom is, right? Is saying, I don't just get to do whatever I want. I actually am the best version of myself, and anything is the best version of itself when there's some type of boundary. So this is why it's easier to bowl with bumpers, because you're going to get a better result most likely, because it can't just go anywhere, right? There's something keeping it going towards its end goal. And that's what religion does for science. It's like the bumpers for science. It's saying, okay, nope, hey, remember, you can't do that. We're going to stay here. We're going to get to where we're going faster without any risk or compromisation to the human person. The first task of Adam in the garden was to have dominion over the garden. So God gave Adam dominion over the animals and of everything in the garden. And if God had not done that, then maybe we would have a case for, like, maybe we're not supposed to really interact with the world, and we're not supposed to learn something about it. But that was the first task that God ever gave humanity, was you have dominion over the world. And science is modern day dominion over the world. And we must do it well. There's a way to do it poorly, and we are given the task to do it well. And what that means is we're not supposed to dominate the world. The world is not ours to do whatever we want with. Just because we can do something does not mean that we should. Just because we can make a human being out of the skin cell from my arm does not mean that we should. And we have to somehow say, oh, right, I don't have dominion over creation. Creation is not ours to control and to manipulate. We have dominion over it. We can't dominate it. And when we get into that realm of domination, then it becomes all about us, right? And our intellects are no longer focused on truth, but they're focused on our own gain and our own self-image. So we always have to kind of come back to this sense of, okay, my task as a human being is to have dominion over the earth and over creation. And what that looks like is allowing creation to be what it is and to understand what is it made for. So what are human beings made for? We're made for heaven. So if science in any way is going to deter from that task, then there's something problematic there, and that's where religion can kind of step in and inform it and take it back on track. I think at the end of the day, what a lot of people in faithful circles are worried about is maybe not being all in on religion, because what if science one day discovers something about God that is going to change my religious belief, right? Like, what if we discover something about God or about creation or about the world that's going to make the fact that I have gone all in on this faith seem really silly, right? And we have to rest in the truth that if it was possible for our intellects to discover something about God that would negate part of who he is, he would not have given us our intellects. It's not possible. It's not possible for us to discover something about God that's going to change who he is. Because our intellect is a gift from him. So there's never going to be a time where we discover something that's going to make the world go, hey, we can prove that God doesn't exist, or that who you've said that he is not true. Because anything that we're discovering is always coming through our intellect, which is a gift from him and is ultimately ordered to him. There's a verse in Ecclesiastes in the Old Testament that I love very much, and I come back to anytime I'm presented with a bioethical issue or something new that has occurred, and it's easy to kind of like lose our peace, right? When we hear about new things, or we're overwhelmed at the state of the world and we don't know, what's the ethical thing to do about new types of medicine or technology or anything like that. And it's easy to just feel overwhelmed and like, well, what's going to happen next, right? Everything is just a snowball effect, and it's just going to lead to something worse, and it's a slippery slope, et cetera, and we can kind of start to panic. There's this verse in Ecclesiastes that says, there's nothing new under the sun. And I get so much peace from that, because what it means is there's not going to ever be a headline that comes out tomorrow that's going to change everything. It's just not going to happen. There's nothing new that we're discovering that's any different than what human beings have ever done before. So yes, we made a baby out of a skin cell, but that's not really new, right? We've always been trying to manipulate creation. We've always been trying to make human beings immortal. We've always been trying to live forever. We've always been trying to dominate the human body. That's not new. This is what it's always been. It's always going to be the case. So that should give us some peace that this temptation of man in the garden to kind of like control, manipulate, hide, make creation our own is not new. And it's always going to continue for as long as we're on earth. And so we can kind of rest in the knowledge of what's actually true is unchanging. Because what's actually true is a person, and that person is God, and he's not changing. And we know who he is, we know who he says he is, and he's deeply in love with every single one of us. And that's unchanging. So we don't need to live with this fear of how can I reconcile the two of these, because they're already reconciled in him. And the more that we immerse ourselves in the truth of these fields and in the complementarity of these fields, the more human we are able to become, because the more time we're spending with truth, which means the more time we're spending with God. Any interaction with authentic truth is always an interaction with God himself. So whether that's coming from the religious side or it's coming from the scientific side, it's an interaction and a development of a relationship with God himself. So if the task of our lives is to get to heaven, right, is to find this completion, to know, love, honor him here so we can serve him and be with him in the next life, then authentically pursuing him through the fields of science and religion and having an authentic encounter with Jesus Christ is the most noble, wonderful task that we can do. There's no task more worthwhile than that. And in doing so, we are able to say, okay, faith and reason, science and religion, the goal of both of these is to get towards the contemplation of truth because that's what we're made for, and we can rest in that because there's nothing more worthwhile than the pursuit and the investigation and the wonder that comes with a life lived in contemplation of Jesus Christ. Thank you. Are there any questions? Yes. I think that art, so there are these things like the three transcendentals, right? Like truth, beauty, and good. And I think that science and religion are both dealing in the realm of truth, and that when someone is like bringing art into the conversation, that would be like religion and art are dealing with beauty. And so it's all pursuing the same person, right? That God is beauty, God is truth, God is goodness. And so we have these different like avenues or tools or roads to get to the same person. And so someone who has a scientific mind is really deeply invested in the avenue of truth to understand God, and an artist is deeply invested in kind of like the way of beauty to understand God. And so in no way are they incompatible, that it's like that we're actually called to like pursue all three of those equally. I think probably science and art go well together, specifically in looking at the created world, and how anything in creation is actually like deeply, deeply beautiful. And so when an artist is inspired by beauty, it's not simply beauty, it's also like the truth found in what is beautiful. So yeah, I would say that they're all deeply intertwined with one another, that they're all building one another up and not negating each other in any way. Yeah. 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 Mm-hmm. Correct. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So kind of like how suffering plays into, like allowing us, suffering plays into new technologies and all that. Yeah. Yeah, so when the Pope wrote Humanae Vitae, he made these kind of like moral predictions, and he wrote it 8 years after the pill was like introduced to the public. So this is in the late 60s. So the pill was introduced in 1961, and then in the late 60s, Pope Paul VI finally wrote something about it, and everyone was kind of like waiting for the Catholic Church to say something because every other religion had come out and said, except LDS and Islam, every other religion had said, yeah, it's fine. Like, people can take hormonal contraception. It's not a big deal. So then when the Pope came out and said, actually, for the Catholic Church, we are going to say that that's not allowed. We're going to instruct the faithful to not take hormonal contraception. He gave really beautiful reasoning for it in Humanae Vitae. And what he essentially was saying was, I'm not trying to like dominate women's bodies. I'm not trying to tell people what to do. But it came from a point of concern specifically for women. And the predictions that he gave were that if we allowed it to become normalized for women to take on the burden of changing their bodies in order to avoid pregnancy, then that would lead to this ripple effect in the morality of society at large. So once we allow that to become the expectation that women are on hormonal birth control, then governments would start trying to manipulate human bodies. They would start trying to force things upon people, and that there would be this kind of like overall moral decline in society. There would be an increase in sexual assault, rape, divorce. So he made these predictions, and he's like, this is just what I think would happen if we asked women to do this. And every single prediction that he made has come true, which is pretty wild. So Humanae Vitae made the world and a lot of people in the church really angry, but if you actually spend time with the text, it's this very tender kind of letter to women in the church, saying like, he's like on our side, saying your body doesn't have to bear this burden. Where I think sometimes the struggle is, right, is that, well, why can't, we do things that are unnatural in medicine all the time, and we think that that's okay, right? So for example, like resuscitating someone, that's unnatural, but we think that's good, right? Or taking ibuprofen or an antibiotic, that's unnatural, right? You're doing something unnatural, you're reversing a course, emergency surgery, that's unnatural, and we're reversing something that's already in motion. So why are some things okay, and this thing that's also unnatural isn't? And his response is because you're actually changing the nature of something current. Just the question of, are we going to let things that are unnatural be okay? It's really the question of the medical side of, is it unnatural and all, the health risks to women, but it's the nature of what's occurring when someone goes on that is fundamentally shifting. And what happens is we're now expecting women's bodies to operate men's bodies. We're saying that the standard for humanity is infertility, right? And that's highly problematic. And what we're saying is women's bodies who are only fertile 5, maybe 7 days out of the month are the ones that we're going to alter instead of men's bodies that are fertile 24/7. So he had all these problems with it. What I think the question of like suffering and how do we kind of like deal with the alleviation of suffering in medicine, and if medicine can kind of alleviate suffering, then why are we going to see it as bad, I think is an important one. And I think in regards specifically to contraception, where it's a painful topic for so many couples and it's so hard, is there's an understanding of this pill could alleviate some suffering, right? Whether there's the wife is struggling from postpartum depression, or her mental health is struggling because she already has a lot of kids, or physically she can't get pregnant again, or there's plenty of reasons, valid reasons, that a couple can choose to not conceive a child at that time. But fundamentally altering the state of the woman's body is not the solution. And so there's a recognition, at least in Catholicism, of we can never really opt out of suffering. It's just kind of part of human life. And while suffering is sanctifying, because it is, it's deeply sanctifying, and it can be used for incredible good, that's the whole like offer it up thing is actually legitimate, that you can actually use your suffering for some spiritual benefit. While suffering has value in Catholicism, God doesn't want us suffering. So in Humanae Vitae, Pope Paul VI recognized that, and he said, I'm going to say that this isn't the solution to that suffering, but I'm going to provide an alternative. I'm not married, but I hear from married people that NFP is easy, right? And I think sometimes it's spoken about like NFP is the easy solution to going on contraception, and I know that it's not possible. But that's kind of his proposal is, you know, to live in this tension of marriage and life is not simple. Suffering is part of it. But the answer is never to fundamentally alter the person or the action that that person is doing. And when any type of contraception enters the sexual relationship, that action is now fundamentally changed. And that's really the root of the issue, is that action is no longer what it's meant to be, which is this like total self-gift of like everything about each party is being totally given and totally and freely received. And if any form of contraception, whether it's hormonal or it's like the use of like a condom or an IUD or anything external, enters in, then what happens is there's no longer this total freedom, because it's kind of like I'm gonna give you all of me except for my fertility, and then that action, it has fundamentally been changed. So it's not so much a question of like the medical bodily aspect, but it's like the action. And when that action is changed, that's why those predictions have come true, because there's this idea of like, well, now we've removed the natural effect of sex, and so it's, you know, people can go cheat on their spouse because the natural effect, like pregnancy, of having sex is gone, and because the action has been altered. And so it has led to this increase in kind of like overall moral decline. Did you say, is that okay? Yeah, the Catholic Church is very pro-organ donation. Pope Benedict XVI spoke about this a lot, that he really encouraged people to, you know, have the fact that they're an organ donor on their license and to register as an organ donor. It's not morally required in any way, so it's not like in any way like sinful or not sinful to do it or to not do it. But it is very pro-organ donation. So there's nothing morally wrong with receiving a body part from another human being, in the same way that there's nothing morally wrong with receiving like a blood transfusion. So we don't see any moral issue with my body assisting another body in functioning well. And it's sort of like the Catholic understanding of like community, and we have a duty to look out for one another. And that's kind of what has informed the Church's stance on organ donation, is duty of my entire life, like my existence is meant to be a gift in some way, and that giftedness is inherently attached. Did that just cut out? No. Okay. It did, right? My giftedness is inherently attached to my body. Like I can't like teach my students without my body, so me being a gift to them, I need my body. In a similar way, gift of self by being an organ donor. And so there's no moral issue unless it's, you know, someone comes in and says, I would like to be a heart donor. And it's like, well, you will die if you're a heart donor. So if it in some way compromises the life of the donor, then we wouldn't allow it. But if it doesn't, if it's like a kidney transplant or something like that where the donor can continue to live, or if it's being registered as a donor at the point of death that we can harvest someone's organs, then the Church is very much okay with it. Does it have a soul? Yes, she does. That is one of the kind of like mysterious things about the fact that God gives us free will, is that when we put matter together, we in some way kind of force God's hand. So this is like the story of Frankenstein is pretty much sort of this foreshadowing of this, that when matter comes together in a human form, there must be ensoulment. And so God has designed humans in a way that when a human person, the matter of a human person exists, there must be a soul there. So even though that person was not created in the traditional manner, that person still has a soul, still has equal dignity. There's still a plan for that person's life. They still ultimately belong in heaven. So that she definitely has a soul. And it's, similar to the way in which when we do things like IVF, like the ensoulment occurs there as well. So anytime the matter of a human being exists and there's life there, that means that there's soul there. Yes, she is. 2 years. Yeah. Did you have your hand up? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah, it's a really good question. So I would say it kind of gets to the point that every religion has its own understanding how faith and science interact, right? And so you could kind of say like, well, obviously religion and science kind of go together. There are very few religions that totally reject science altogether. So then it's like, okay, well then what lens, what perspective do we actually take as true? So obviously we're kind of like operating in the Catholic realm. So I would say, to have skepticism of, someone can say like, oh, the earth is like X number of years old, and to like truly investigate the scientific facts behind that. So like where is science actually true? Like what can we actually prove about just the science? And then in terms of how it kind of is complementarity with the biblical aspect of our faith, Catholicism understands that there's some parts of the Bible that are literal, and then there are some that are kind of metaphorical. So the creation story, while I obviously think that there's a lot to be learned from that, it's not really written as like a literal story, right? That we don't need to say, oh, someone named Adam and Eve actually lived in this garden, etc. That it's used as myth, meaning that maybe it happened, but really that's not the point is to not write this like historical testimony of these two people, but it's really to say what are the lessons learned in this story and what do they tell us about how God works. So I think a lot of people are like, well, you have to be on like the creationist side or the evolution side, and I think we have reached a point in science where it's pretty clear that the earth didn't start when the Bible was written, right? That it's like if you like trace historically how many years the Bible is kind of like referring to, that reaches an age where the earth is far too young than it actually is that we can scientifically prove. So it kind of gets to this point of like, well, why couldn't evolution be how God created the world? Like, of course he could have. Like, it's still intelligent design to say, oh, God set all this in motion and oversaw it, right? And his hand was guiding it. Why can't evolution and God go together? That we don't need to be like purely in this, like it was just Adam and Eve and the creation story is like pure fact, and you know the earth is only like 8,000 years old or whatever. That science can inform the way that we read biblical texts, because the church has never said everything in the Bible needs to be taken literally. So science, I think the truths of science actually complement that fact. I'm not sure if that answers your question. Does it? No, you're good. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so when any like new like scientific innovation comes out, or new scientific theories or whatever, we're always trying to check it with the truth of how we understand natural law. So natural law comes into play a lot, which is essentially the idea that we can understand that there's a certain value system present in humanity before we get to the point of religion. So things like life really matters, community matters, education matters. That if you just like dumped a bunch of people on an island, they would start to like respect life, they would start to educate one another, they would form communities, things like that. So we use natural law a lot to kind of guide our understanding of scientific progress of, does this violate natural law in any way? So is this violating human life? Is this violating the family? Things like that. And then religion, and the Catholic Church specifically, really takes its time. And I think that's where a lot of frustration can sometimes come in, because science does move so rapidly, and the church moves pretty slowly, because the church, in her wisdom, is trying to appropriately respond and respond in the most truthful way. So we look at our understanding of God and our understanding of human nature and human value and say, does this new scientific theory work alongside this, or does it somehow violate it? So the church isn't really going to make a statement much on theories as much as it is going to make a statement on developments. So, for example, the Catholic Church has a very clear statement on vaccines that it spent a lot of time working on, and then clarified again about a decade after they originally wrote it. And people were like, come on, like give us this thing about vaccines. And the church took a lot of time, because it didn't matter much about, like new scientific theories weren't really going to affect the faithful that much, but scientific developments that are available to the faithful is what we're really going to be concerned about, because those are things where we're like, oh, like in the early 2000s, everyone was like, is it okay to get the chickenpox vaccine? Like, can someone tell us? And so that's the kind of science the church really concerns herself with in regards to putting out statements on things. And that goes through what's called the Pontifical Academy for Life, which is over in Rome. And it's a bunch of ethicists and theologians and philosophers who sit with scientists and people who really understand that science and kind of talk about it for years before putting out a statement. Any other questions? Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the church's stance on any type of artificial reproductive technology is that it must honor in the best way the integrated original nature of the sexual act. So it's not that, the church doesn't kind of look at new things and go, well, that's wrong because it's new or whatever. So it's kind of like taking a step back and saying, well, what is the purpose of sex? Unity and procreation. And so the church is really values that so much and puts so much sacredness on that the sexual act is first unitive and then it's procreative. So it's first for the role of uniting spouses and then it's also procreative. I feel like this keeps going. To remove one of those is to alter the sexual act itself. So, to remove the unitive aspect is problematic, and then to remove the procreative aspect or to alter the procreative aspect either through contraception or on the other side, other ways, the church is really cautious about. So the church's stance on that is, it's such a heavy cross to struggle with infertility in any way. And the church recognizes that and recognizes that the desire for children is deeply holy and incredibly beautiful. But counsels parents to not seek those out for a couple reasons, mainly because it alters the sexual act and that there's something that human beings have a right to be conceived through that. So the church thinks that. And then that there's, it kind of exists on a scale. So IUI, the church would say, is less serious than IVF because in IUI, it's still all happening kind of like within the woman's body. But with IVF, the problem is that conception and fertilization happens outside the womb, and there is the problem of the bonus embryos. And so 1 or 2 embryos take, we rejoice at that life, but we have to acknowledge that if we really think life begins at conception, then what's happening to those other embryos and how can we honor their life and their dignity? So for those reasons, the church counsels couples to not seek those out as fertility treatments and proposes, there's this thing called NAPRO technology that the church is very supportive of, which is ways to look at what might be causing infertility with a couple, whether it's something with the husband, something with the wife, and to do series of hormone treatments and all of that as an alternative to IVF, but in order to retain the integrated nature of the sexual act. That's the church's stance on that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm. Mm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right, yeah, I definitely agree. And I would say that that's where, religion's role in guiding science and kind of informing science and, again, like kind of creating those boundaries for science would really play in that, science is at its best and it flourishes when it learns from that, right? That if science understood that its field is to exist for the service of others and to exist as like a gift for others and to help our neighbor, then I think science would be able to maybe more adequately respond to a lot of the needs of our day. But I think that it goes into, if the call of the human heart is to exist in the image and likeness of God and to exist in relation with other people and to be kind of like this image of the Trinity, then anything that's not that means that like I forget the fact that I'm in relationship with the rest of the world, and then I turn inward. So I think that's where science can get skewed, and anything can get skewed, is when it becomes about me and I'm grasping at these things for my own sake and my own self-interest in some way. Then it becomes this abuse of my intellect and an abuse of my freedom, instead of kind of having this like outward disposition towards the world. So yeah, I would say that anytime science isn't operating at its best, it's a falling short of the fact that we're made to be in the image and likeness of God, and that's not just like a cute idea, but that's like a daily call to be outwardly focused and be in relationship with our fellow man. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. 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 Mhm. Yeah. I hope there aren't basements full of clones, but I guess you never know. I think so. China was sanctioned, so there are rules, and then there's China. So like China kind of doesn't really listen, but yeah, there are rules. So there's like an international bioethics community that was kind of first begun at the Nuremberg trials. So the Nuremberg trials created the Nuremberg Code, and that was the first time that we were like, the international sort of be looking at the way we're treating human beings. So there's a standard of ethical action in regards to bioethical investigation. So China was sanctioned, so that happened, and they didn't. So you're supposed to tell people if you do something like that, and they didn't tell anyone. And so they all of a sudden were like, "Hey guys, look what we did." And so they were sanctioned. So we're hoping that they haven't replicated that. It's illegal in the Western world to use the CRISPR technology for that purpose. The problem with anytime we do something new like that is we now know that we can do it. And so what usually happens is we're like, oh yeah, that's so bad. And then in 20 years, we're like, oh, well, it's okay. Because it kind of has seeped into our consciousness of this is possible. And so once something is done, it's really hard for the world to kind of go back, even if the initial response is that was really unethical. So where I think we're going, so this CRISPR technology is a gene editing technology, and it's available in the United States. And where I think we're headed is this kind of new age of techno-eugenics, where we can edit someone's genes while they're in utero. So we can already do this in IVF when we create babies outside of the womb. We can already edit genes, right? So we can already like self-select for things where it's like, okay, I want my baby to have blue eyes, not brown eyes. I'm only going to implant embryos with blue eyes, like et cetera. So we can already kind of do that. But what CRISPR has given us the availability to do is look in someone's genetic makeup and alter the genes themselves. So if we test for Down syndrome, we can just like remove that, right? Like remove that extra chromosome, and then that human being no longer has Down syndrome. So I think that's kind of the future, which is not looking great for us, because what essentially then can happen is that because we already kind of naturally live in a classist society, that people who have access to that technology are going to pay to have children that have really high IQs, really, excellent physique, look a certain way, can perform a certain way in all these different manners. And then we kind of have this eugenics that's going on where we're removing any type of disability or any trait that's less than ideal, but the only people who are able to do that are the people who have monetary access to it. And then there's going to kind of be this world of sort of like perfect humans and then everyone else. So that's kind of where I think that we're headed, is this sort of field of like techno-eugenics that has somewhat already kind of begun a little bit. Like, how did we cut it off? I'm not sure what the failing point would be. What I assume it would be is some type of civil war, is kind of like what I think socially that ends up looking like, is that there's some type of rebellion against that, whether that's some type of like, cyber thing. We kind of already, like on social media, sort of exist in a civil war, but I think that there would be some type of reaction against the technology itself, so some way to kind of like bring that down. It sounds incredibly dystopian and fake, but it's the fact that we can already edit genes is sort of already available. So I think that there would be some type of civil war of like a rejection of that group of people who, by no choice of their own, have been created in a certain way. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, you would hope that that there would be kind of like a stalemate and a stabilization of it. I think it's difficult, especially in the States, because medical technology and healthcare is part of our economy. And so anytime there's an ability for someone to make money off of the use of these things, it's really hard to then keep it totally under control and to shut things like that down. So that's kind of my more skeptical view of that, is because, somewhere someone would be making money off of providing this technology to people who had access to pay for it. I think it would be hard to do that, but I would hope that that would happen in some way. Any other final questions before I send you guys to the doc? Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. It ends on a good note. So a couple books that are really good. There are these two bioethicists called Beauchamp and Childress, and they wrote what's called the Belmont Report back in the 70s. And they started what's called the Hastings Center. So the Hastings Center is like the official institution of bioethics in the United States, and it's located in Philadelphia. So the Hastings Center consistently puts out excellent literature regarding modern bioethical issues. So they're constantly writing things, so you can go to their website, and what's great about them is they are totally independently funded, so it doesn't have any like political skew or any like even like religious bend. It's just purely like, here's the ethical evaluation of these new technologies. So the Hastings Center is a really great place to look. I would recommend reading Humanae Vitae. I think that's a great source. Any papal encyclical, I think, is really excellent. And then there's a bioethicist at Notre Dame. His name is Carter Sneed, and he writes on kind of like the integration of Catholicism specifically and ethics and technology, and he has a really great viewpoint. It's just like very like traditionally Catholic, like in line with the church, and he has really great stuff on that. So those are a couple of sources that I'd send you to, yeah. Carter Sneed. Mm-hmm. Yes, I have heard of them. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, they have like a 24/7 hotline that you can call. So they have kind of like bioethicists on call. They're under like a little bit of heat right now, but I think they're a great source because it's like if you actually want to talk to a bioethicist, they kind of just have bioethicists on call. So if you need to talk to a person, you're like, here's my circumstance. They're a great place to look for sure. Yeah. All right, any other questions? All right, thank you so much. Oh, yeah.
I just want to thank Teresa for being here and for sharing, obviously, the gift that God has given her in her intellect and her pursuit of this like very lofty field of study, and like what a blessing that we have, like that we have someone like her teaching our high schoolers at JP2, and just knowing that that group of students is coming out of that school with this like deep understanding of bioethics. So let's give her one more big round of applause. As per usual, we left the last 30 minutes or so before classes get out over there for you guys just to be able to spend some time in fellowship. The dock is open. Get yourself a drink, hang out, and get to share some fellowship with one another. I think Teresa was going to hang out for a little bit more if you had other questions, you want to pick her brain. But let's go ahead and we'll just close out in prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Good and gracious God, we thank you so much for this evening. We thank you for all the people here on campus tonight, all the students, catechists, all of the adults that are here, all of those that have shared of their time and talent to help bring you more fully into our community, to help us to understand you and your teaching, Lord, the teaching of your church. We ask for a special blessing upon all those who are seeking sacraments this year as they draw closer to the sacramental masses and coming into a deeper relationship and a deeper initiation into your love. And we just bring all of our intentions for all of those that we hold in our hearts, but especially for right now for all of those that are struggling with loneliness and illnesses, that they just may be lifted up and find joy and peace, knowing how much they are loved by you, Lord. And we lift up our intentions. We ask for our Mother Mary to pray for us, to intercede on our behalf, and to wrap us in her mantle of protection as we pray, Hail Mary, full of grace. The Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. One last thing, if you guys are parents who are going back over to pick up your kids after hanging out at the dock for a little bit, do me a favor, and if you see catechists that you don't know, give them a big thank you, because of an assortment of things, we had 7 catechists call out this week, and it was like deaths in the family and sicknesses and just like scheduling errors and a bunch of stuff. So we have like at least 7 other adults that are out over there, and they're just like involved with other ministries around the church, and they're like, we'll come help because we don't want to have to cancel this for the kids. So if you see them, tell them thank you, because this was a huge blessing to be able to still have our Summa night for all the little kids over there. So thank you guys so much, and we'll see you over at the dock.